"Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you," CEO Eloise Clark laughed, her designer heels clicking against the hangar concrete as employees recorded the moment on their phones. Eric Edwards, the quiet janitor in his worn uniform who'd spent 3 years invisible mopping floors and cleaning windows, just smiled and wiped down the cockpit windows with steady hands that had once commanded the skies. 10 minutes later, the $20 million prototype roared to life, lifting off flawlessly under his expert control. When it landed perfectly, the entire facility fell silent. What they didn't know was that Eric used to command the skies as a decorated military flight instructor. But before the flight that changed everything, there was a different man. If you're enjoying this story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories that will touch your heart. 7 years ago, Lieutenant Colonel Eric Edwards was one of the most respected tactical flight instructors in the United States Air Force. At 33 years old, he'd logged over 3,000 flight hours across 15 different aircraft types, trained hundreds of pilots who went on to serve in combat zones worldwide, and held a reputation for being able to fly anything with rotors or wings. His colleagues called him Steady Eddie, because nothing rattled him, not engine failures at 10,000 feet, not hostile fire over desert combat zones, not the pressure of training cocky 22-year-olds who thought they knew everything about flying. Eric lived on base at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada with his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Ella. Sarah was a pediatric nurse at the base hospital, beautiful and brilliant, with endless patience for both sick children and her husband's obsession with aviation. They'd met during Eric's first deployment. She'd treated his broken arm after a training accident, and he'd fallen in love with her while she lectured him about proper safety protocols. Life was good, better than good. Eric would wake up at 5 a.m., run 5 miles around the base, eat breakfast with Sarah while Ella threw Cheerios from her high chair, then head to the flight line where he'd spend the day teaching young pilots how to stay alive in hostile skies. Evenings meant family dinners, bath time battles with a giggling toddler, and falling asleep beside the woman he loved while desert stars filled the sky outside their base housing window. The accident happened on a Tuesday during a routine training exercise. Eric was flying as an instructor in an Apache helicopter with a student pilot named Lieutenant Morrison practicing low-altitude maneuvers over the Nevada desert. Morrison was talented but overconfident, the kind of pilot who needed to learn humility before he got himself killed. They were at 200 feet, executing a tactical evasion pattern, when a freak wind shear hit, a sudden downdraft caused by temperature inversions in the desert air, the kind of thing that happens maybe once in 10,000 flight hours. Morrison panicked and overcorrected. Eric took control instantly, his muscle memory and 3,000 hours of experience taking over, fighting the unstable aircraft toward a controlled emergency landing. They almost made it. The helicopter hit hard in a dry wash, the landing gear collapsing, the fuselage tearing open as they skidded across rocks and sand. Morrison walked away with minor bruises. Eric's back took the impact meant for both of them. 3 fractured vertebrae, herniated discs, spinal cord compression. He woke up in the base hospital with Sarah holding his hand and doctors explaining that he'd never fly again. The spinal injuries weren't life-threatening, but they disqualified him from military aviation permanently. Too much risk of paralysis if he ejected, too much chronic pain to handle the physical stress of high-G maneuvers, too much nerve damage for the Air Force to trust him with multi-million-dollar aircraft and young pilots' lives. Eric spent 6 months in rehabilitation, learning to walk without wincing, building core strength to manage the pain, accepting that the career he'd built since he was 18 years old was over at 33. The Air Force offered him desk positions, instructor roles in classrooms instead of cockpits, administrative work at the Pentagon, consulting positions with defense contractors. all honourable, all well paid, all involving flying a desk instead of an aircraft. He couldn't do it. The thought of sitting in meetings discussing aviation while never touching the controls again felt like drowning slowly. So Eric took medical retirement, accepted his disability benefits, packed up his family, and tried to figure out who he was if he wasn't a pilot. They moved to Portland, Oregon, where Sarah's sister lived. Sarah found work at a children's hospital. Eric tried to find himself. He applied for civilian pilot positions, but his medical discharge made airlines nervous. He considered engineering jobs. He had a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering from the Air Force Academy, but 7 years away from academic work and a resume focused entirely on military flying didn't translate well to corporate R&D departments. For a year, Eric was a stay-at-home dad while Ella started preschool and Sarah worked long shifts at the hospital. He told himself it was temporary, that he was supporting his wife's career the way she'd supported his military service, that being present for Ella's childhood was valuable, and it was. But it also felt like drowning. Every time he saw aircraft overhead, every time he heard rotor blades in the distance, every time he drove past the small regional airport, something in his chest tightened with loss. Sarah saw it. She tried to help, suggesting therapy, encouraging him to find new hobbies, reminding him that he was more than his career. But the depression crept in anyway, that grey fog that made everything feel distant and meaningless. Eric went through the motions, making breakfast, playing with Ella, doing laundry, cooking dinner, while feeling like a ghost in his own life. Then Sarah got sick. It started with fatigue she attributed to long hospital shifts. Then came the headaches, the nausea, the weight loss she couldn't explain. By the time they caught the ovarian cancer, it had already spread to her liver and lungs. Stage 4. Inoperable. The oncologist gave her 6 months to a year with aggressive treatment. Sarah lived for 8 months after diagnosis, fighting with everything she had while Eric watched helplessly from the sidelines. He'd faced down enemy fire, landed damaged helicopters in desert storms, trained pilots how to survive impossible situations. But he couldn't save his wife, couldn't fix this, couldn't do anything except hold her hand and tell Ella that Mommy was fighting very hard, but sometimes bodies get too sick to win. Sarah died on a Thursday morning in their bedroom, with Eric beside her and Ella's school principal, holding the 4-year-old in the living room, because Eric couldn't let his daughter watch her mother's final breath. The funeral was small. Sarah's family, a few nurse colleagues, some neighbours who'd brought casseroles and kind words Eric couldn't hear through the ringing numbness in his head. After Sarah died, Eric had to figure out how to be both parents to a traumatized 4-year-old while managing his own grief and chronic pain. Sarah's life insurance helped financially, but money didn't solve the problem of a child who cried for her mama every night or a father who didn't know how to explain why good people died for no reason. Eric needed work, partly for income to supplement his disability pension, partly for structure, mostly because sitting home alone with his thoughts while Ella was at school was unbearable. But his qualifications were strange. Military tactical flight instructor with aerospace engineering degree and crippling back injury. Not exactly what civilian employers were looking for. He found work as a night janitor at Aero Sky Corporation, a mid-sized aviation company in Portland that designed and manufactured helicopters for medical transport, search and rescue, and corporate use. The job paid $13 an hour, required no experience beyond the ability to clean, and had a night shift that meant Eric could be home when Ella got out of school. His sister-in-law, Margaret, watched Ella overnight while Eric worked 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. An arrangement that wasn't ideal, but functioned. Eric became invisible, the maintenance man in the blue uniform who emptied trash, mopped floors, cleaned windows, and sanitized bathrooms. Nobody at Aerosky knew about Lieutenant Colonel Edwards, tactical flight instructor. Nobody knew he could identify every aircraft in their hangar by sound alone, or that he spotted design flaws in their prototypes while wiping down cockpit glass. Nobody asked, and Eric didn't tell them. It was easier to be nobody. Ella was now 9 years old, 3rd grade, smart and resilient, despite losing her mother. She had Sarah's auburn hair and Eric's green eyes, and she remembered her mother mostly through photos and stories Eric told her. Every morning before school, Ella would hug Eric tight and say the same thing. "Daddy, you don't need medals to be a pilot. You'll always be my hero." Eric kept his old military ID card in his wallet. The edges worn, lamination peeling, the photo showing a younger man in uniform who looked confident and purposeful. Sometimes late at night while cleaning, Eric would look at that photo and barely recognize himself. He traded flight suits for janitor uniforms, command for invisibility, purpose for survival. But he was still Ella's father, and that mattered more than what he'd lost. Aerosky Corporation was preparing for something big. The company had spent 3 years and $40 million developing the Valkyrie V9, a cutting-edge helicopter with a revolutionary autopilot system that promised to change the industry. The engineering team was brilliant, PhDs from MIT and Stanford, specialists in avionics and aerospace design, programmers who could code flight control systems in their sleep. But none of them were pilots. They could design aircraft, calculate thrust-to-weight ratios, program autopilot sequences. Actually flying the thing, sitting in the cockpit and trusting their own work at 5,000 feet, that was different. Fear had a way of making even the smartest people hesitate. Eloise Clark was 30 years old and CEO of Aerosky Corporation. She'd inherited the company from her father 2 years ago when he died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving her a multi-million-dollar aviation business she barely understood. Eloise had an MBA from Harvard, 3 years of management consulting experience, and zero patience for weakness or excuses. To her, employees were resources, numbers on spreadsheets, tools to be used efficiently. She especially looked down on the maintenance staff. They were invisible to her, background noise in her empire, barely more relevant than the janitorial equipment they used. She'd walked past Eric Edwards hundreds of times without seeing him, the way you might walk past a lamp or a trash can. The Valkyrie V9 sat in the main hangar like a sleeping predator. Sleek black metal, curved glass, technology most people couldn't comprehend. Eloise stood beside it in her tailored Armani suit and 4-inch Louboutin heels, arms crossed, staring at her team of 20 engineers who shuffled nervously and avoided eye contact. Eric was nearby emptying trash cans, moving quietly and efficiently. Years of military discipline made him notice everything. He saw the fear in the engineer's eyes, understood it immediately. Flying something new always carried risk. But he also saw something else. The Valkyrie V9 was beautiful, perfectly balanced, the rotor system flawless. Whoever designed this knew what they were doing. Eloise's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "We launch in 1 week. Someone needs to test this aircraft, not the simulator, the real thing." Nobody volunteered. Eloise looked around the room with undisguised disgust. "I'm surrounded by cowards." Eric kept working, but he smiled slightly. He'd heard officers talk like that before. Fear and anger dressed up as leadership. It never worked. The next morning, tension filled the hangar. Eloise had called an emergency meeting, her heels echoing against the concrete floor as she paced in front of the Valkyrie V9. 20 engineers stood in a semicircle looking miserable. "Let me understand this correctly," Eloise said, her voice dangerously quiet. "We have spent 3 years and $40 million developing this aircraft. We have media coverage scheduled. We have potential buyers flying in from 6 countries. And not one of you has the courage to test it?" An older engineer named Dr. Marcus Chen spoke up nervously. "Miss Clark, with respect, the autopilot system is completely new. If something goes wrong at altitude, the manual override might not respond fast enough. We need a professional test pilot, someone with military experience who—" "We don't have time to hire an outside pilot," Eloise snapped. "You're all engineers, not pilots. I understand that. But somebody in this company must have basic flight training." Silence. Eric was working near the rear of the hangar, cleaning the windows of the observation room. He had his back turned, but he heard every word. Without thinking, he spoke, his voice calm and casual. "Maybe you need someone who's both." Everyone turned. Eloise's eyes landed on him like a spotlight, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something close to amusement. "Excuse me?" Eric set down his cleaning supplies and walked closer, movements slow and non-threatening, old habit from diffusing tense situations. "You said you need someone who's an engineer and a pilot. Maybe you're looking in the wrong places." Eloise stared at him for a long moment, then laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. "Are you serious? You're a janitor." "I'm also an aerospace engineer with a degree from the Air Force Academy and about 3,000 flight hours," Eric said evenly. "Mostly helicopters, some fixed wing. I can fly your Valkyrie V9 if you need someone who's both qualified and willing." The hangar went completely silent. Engineers exchanged shocked glances. Eloise's smile faded into something colder, more calculating. "You're lying," she said flatly. Eric pulled out his wallet, extracted his military ID card, and handed it to her. "Lieutenant Colonel Eric Edwards, United States Air Force, retired. Tactical flight instructor. You can verify it." Eloise looked at the ID, then at Eric, then back at the ID. Her perfectly manicured fingers traced the worn edges, the faded photo of a younger man in uniform. "Why are you working as a janitor if you have these qualifications?" "Medical retirement. Back injury. Airlines won't touch me with the medical discharge. I needed work with flexible hours to raise my daughter alone." Eric's voice was matter of fact, no self-pity, just stating facts. "The Valkyrie V9 is a beautiful machine. Shame to let it sit because nobody's brave enough to trust their own work." Eloise's eyes narrowed. This wasn't what she'd expected. A janitor with military flight credentials was absurd, too convenient, too perfectly solving her problem. Part of her suspected some elaborate joke, but the ID looked legitimate, and the way he talked about aviation had a casual expertise you couldn't fake. "Prove it," Eloise said suddenly, an idea forming. "If you're really a qualified pilot, prove it. Right now." "How?" Eric asked. Eloise's smile returned, sharper this time. "Fly the Valkyrie V9. Take it up, circle the facility, land it without crashing. If you can do that, I'll believe your credentials. Hell, I'll even give you a promotion." She paused, then added with theatrical mockery, "In fact, if you can fly this helicopter successfully, I'll marry you." Laughter erupted from the assembled engineers and employees who'd gathered to watch. Phones came out to record the moment, the CEO publicly mocking the janitor, the absurdity of the bet, the entertainment value of humiliation. Eric just looked at her calmly. "You're serious?" "Completely. Fly the helicopter, marry the CEO. Can't do it. Stay in your lane and keep cleaning toilets." Eric glanced at the Valkyrie V9, then back at Eloise. "I'll need 10 minutes to do a pre-flight inspection. The aircraft's safety matters more than your ego." More laughter, but nervous now. This janitor wasn't reacting like someone caught in a lie. He was acting like a pilot. Eric walked to the helicopter with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. He moved around the aircraft systematically, checking the rotor assembly, inspecting the tail rotor, examining the landing gear hydraulics, testing control surface movement. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, and the engineers watching started to realize something. He knew exactly what he was doing. Dr. Chen approached hesitantly. "Mr. Edwards, if you're actually going to fly this, you should know the autopilot system is experimental. Manual override is on the collective, but the fly-by-wire system has a 3-second delay if you need to take direct control." 3 seconds is manageable, Eric replied, not looking up from his inspection of the tail rotor. "What's the gross weight and center of gravity on this configuration?" 12,400 pounds, CG at station 180. "Fuel load? Full, 800 pounds. Eric nodded, still working. "Engine limitations?" "Turbine temp red line at 850 degrees. Torque limit 95%. "Got it." Eric finished his inspection and opened the cockpit door. The interior was state-of-the-art. Glass cockpit displays, touchscreen interfaces, autopilot controls that looked like something from a sci-fi movie. But underneath all the new technology, it was still just a helicopter. The fundamentals hadn't changed. Eric settled into the pilot's seat, adjusted it for his height, fastened the 5-point harness, and began the startup checklist from memory. His hands moved across switches and controls with the unconscious precision of muscle memory built over 3,000 hours. The hangar had fallen completely silent. Even Eloise had stopped smiling, watching with something between fascination and growing unease. The engine spooled up with a rising whine. Rotor blades began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of helicopter flight filling the massive space. Eric checked instruments, verified systems, confirmed control responses. Everything looked good. Through the headset, he heard Dr. Chen's voice. "Mr. Edwards, you're cleared for takeoff. Winds are calm, ceiling unlimited." "Copy that," Eric replied. "Lifting off now." The Valkyrie V9 rose smoothly, Eric's hands and feet making tiny adjustments on the controls, the aircraft responding instantly to his inputs. He held a stable hover 10 feet off the hangar floor for 30 seconds, a test of control authority and pilot skill, then gently increased collective pitch and transitioned to forward flight. The helicopter accelerated out of the hangar and into open sky. Eric kept the altitude low initially, feeling out the aircraft's handling characteristics, testing the cyclic response and pedal coordination. The Valkyrie V9 flew beautifully, responsive but stable, powerful but predictable. Whoever designed this had done exceptional work. He climbed to 500 feet and began a gentle orbit around the Aerosky facility, letting the engineers and Eloise see that he wasn't just hovering, he was actually flying. Eric performed a few basic maneuvers, coordinated turns, speed changes, climbs and descents. Nothing aggressive, just demonstrating complete control. Inside the hangar, Eloise stood frozen, watching through the massive doors as the Janitor executed textbook flight patterns in her $40 million prototype. Her mind raced. This wasn't possible. Janitors didn't fly military helicopters. This had to be. But the ID had looked real, and the way he flew, smooth, confident, professional, that wasn't something you could fake. After 8 minutes, Eric brought the Valkyrie V9 back toward the hangar. He slowed to a hover over the landing pad, held it rock steady for 10 seconds, then executed a perfect touchdown, gentle, centered, exactly where he'd lifted off from. The engines wound down, rotors slowing, until everything was still. Eric completed the shutdown checklist, secured the aircraft, and climbed out. He walked back toward the assembled crowd, who stared at him in absolute silence. Eloise found her voice first. That was a basic test flight," Eric finished. "Your Valkyrie V9 flies well. The autopilot integration is smooth. Manual controls are responsive. No vibration issues I could detect. You should be proud of the work your team did." "You're really a military pilot," Eloise said, more statement than question. Was, Eric corrected. Medical retirement ended that. But I still know how to fly. One of the engineers started clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire hangar erupted in applause, not for Eloise, but for the janitor who'd just proved everyone wrong. Eloise stood there, her face unreadable, as her employees celebrated someone else's achievement. She'd spent 2 years running this company, fighting for respect in a male-dominated industry, proving she deserved to lead despite inheriting the position from her father. And now, in less than 10 minutes, a janitor had captured more genuine admiration from her staff than she'd ever received. "My office," she said curtly. "Now." Eric followed Eloise through the facility to the executive floor, still in his janitor uniform, very aware of the stares from employees they passed. Eloise's office was exactly what he'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Portland, modern furniture, expensive art, everything designed to project power and success. She closed the door and turned to face him. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why were you working as a janitor when you have these qualifications?" "I needed a job with night shifts so I could raise my daughter during the day. Nobody asks janitors about their background. It was easier to be invisible than to explain why a military pilot was cleaning toilets." "You could have applied for positions in our engineering department, flight operations, anywhere besides maintenance." Eric shook his head. "I'm medically disqualified from commercial flight operations. My back injury makes insurance companies nervous, and I've been out of academic engineering for years. Plus, I needed immediate income after my wife died. The janitorial position was available and didn't ask questions." Eloise studied him for a long moment. "You just proved you can fly our most advanced prototype perfectly. The media event is in 5 days. I need someone to demonstrate the Valkyrie V9 to potential buyers. Will you do it? Are you offering me a job or making a request?" "I'm offering you a contract position as test pilot for the demonstration flight. $15,000 for the week, with potential for more work if this goes well." Eric's mind calculated quickly. $15,000 was more than he made in an entire year as a janitor. It would cover Ella's school expenses, fix the car transmission that was dying, maybe even build a college fund. But it also meant stepping back into the world he'd left behind, accepting that people would know who he used to be. "What about the marriage proposal?" Eric asked with slight amusement. Eloise's face flushed. I was mocking you. Obviously, I'm not actually going to marry you because you flew a helicopter." "Obviously," Eric agreed, "but you made the offer publicly, in front of cameras. Some of your employees recorded it. Might want to clarify that wasn't a binding legal commitment before this becomes a PR issue." Eloise pinched the bridge of her nose. This day had gotten away from her completely. "Fine, we'll call it hyperbole. Do you want the contract position or not?" "I want my daughter to be proud of me," Eric said quietly. "I want her to see her father doing something that matters instead of hiding. So yes, I'll fly your demonstration. But I have conditions, such as, I work nights currently so I can be with Ella during the day. I'll need the demonstration flight scheduled for evenings or weekends. I'll also need the contract to include proper insurance coverage given my medical history. And I want your engineer's full technical specifications on the Valkyrie V9 before I fly it for buyers. No surprises." Eloise nodded slowly. "Agreed. But I have a condition too." "What?" "You stop cleaning toilets and move to our flight operations department. Even if this is temporary, I'm not having the pilot demonstrating our flagship aircraft show up in a janitor uniform. We'll find you something appropriate until the contract ends." Eric considered this. Part of him wanted to stay invisible, to keep his head down and avoid complications. But Ella's words echoed in his mind. "You'll always be my hero." Maybe it was time to stop hiding. "Deal," Eric said, extending his hand. Eloise shook it, her grip firm and businesslike. "Welcome to the team, Lieutenant Colonel Edwards." "Just Eric is fine. The rank doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to the engineers who will be working with you," Eloise replied. "And it definitely matters to the buyers who will see a former military flight instructor demonstrating our technology. Experience sells aircraft." Over the next 5 days, Eric transformed from invisible janitor to visible flight operations specialist. Eloise's PR team had a field day with his background. Former Air Force tactical instructor, aerospace engineer, single father rebuilding his life. The narrative was perfect. Redemption through skill, second chances, the American dream. Media coverage exploded after someone posted the hangar video online. CEO mocks janitor. Janitor flies 20 minutes helicopter perfectly. Eric hated the attention, but he understood it served a purpose. Aerosky's stock price jumped 12% in 3 days. Buyer inquiries flooded in from companies who'd never heard of them before. The Valkyrie V9 went from an industry curiosity to a must-see demonstration. Ella watched her father on the news and asked questions Eric struggled to answer. "Why were you cleaning floors if you can fly helicopters? How do you explain to a 9-year-old that grief and pain had made you choose invisibility? That sometimes people hide from who they are because it hurts less than facing what they've lost?" "Sometimes grown-ups get lost," Eric told her, "and sometimes we need something to help us find our way back. For me, it was that helicopter. And you, always you, reminding me who I really am." The demonstration flight was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at a private airfield outside Portland, with perfect flying weather, clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited. Potential buyers flew in from Germany, Japan, Dubai, and 3 major U.S. hospital systems looking to upgrade their med-evac helicopters. Representatives from aviation industry publications sat in the observation area with notebooks and cameras. Media crews set up cameras for live streaming. Eloise wore a power suit that cost more than Eric's monthly salary and worked the crowd with practiced charm, explaining technical specifications and answering questions with the confidence of someone who'd finally grown into her leadership role. Eric performed pre-flight checks under dozens of watching eyes, the ritual familiar and centering. The Valkyrie V9 gleamed in afternoon sunlight, every surface polished, every system tested and ready. This was what he'd missed, not the attention, but the purpose, the knowledge that his skills mattered, that he was doing something he was genuinely good at. The flight was flawless. Eric demonstrated every capability of the Valkyrie V9, precision hover, high-speed flight, autopilot engagement and disengagement, emergency procedures, even some advanced maneuvers that made the buyers lean forward in their seats. The aircraft performed perfectly, and Eric's calm professional narration over the radio explained exactly what he was doing and why it mattered. When he landed, the buyers applauded. Eloise fielded questions and negotiated deals, while Eric secured the aircraft and completed post-flight documentation. By evening, Aerosky had preliminary contracts worth $60 million. The Valkyrie V9 was a success. Eloise found Eric in the hangar afterward, alone, running his hand along the helicopter's fuselage with something like affection. "You did good today," she said. "The aircraft did good. I just flew it." That's not what the buyers said. They specifically mentioned your professionalism and expertise. 3 of them asked if you'd be involved in delivery training. Eric turned to look at her. "I'm a contractor. This was a one-time thing." "It doesn't have to be," Eloise said carefully. "I spoke with our board. They approved creating a permanent position, Director of Flight Operations. You'd oversee test flights, train pilots, consult on future aircraft development. Salary is $95,000 base plus benefits. Hours are flexible enough that you could still be home for your daughter. Eric stared at her. $95,000, a real career, using his actual skills. The ability to be both a pilot and a father. It was everything he'd given up hope of finding. "Why?" he asked. "You humiliated me a week ago, called me a janitor like it was an insult. Why offer this now?" Eloise had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Because I was wrong. Because you're qualified, and we need someone with your experience. And because watching you fly reminded me why my father built this company. He loved aviation, loved the engineering, loved knowing our helicopters saved lives. I've been so focused on profits and stock prices that I forgot the actual purpose. You reminded me." "I still can't fly commercially because of medical restrictions," Eric pointed out. "You can fly test flights and demonstrations under experimental aircraft regulations. I checked. And the job is more than just flying. It's training, development, consultation. Your expertise is valuable even on the ground." Eric thought about Ella, about giving her a stable future, about stepping back into a world where he mattered, about proving that losing his military career didn't mean losing everything. "I need to think about it. Talk to my daughter." "Take the weekend," Eloise said. "But Eric, for what it's worth, I'm sorry I judged you. I'm sorry I couldn't see past the uniform. You deserved better than that." It was the most honest thing she'd said to him. Eric nodded acknowledgement and left to pick up Ella from Margaret's house. That night, Eric sat with his daughter in their small apartment and told her about the job offer. Ella listened with 9-year-old seriousness, then asked, "Will you be happy?" "I think so," Eric said. "It means I get to fly again, not like before, but enough. And I get to use my brain, help build aircraft, maybe teach other pilots. It feels right." Ella hugged him tight. "Then you should do it, Daddy. Mommy would want you to be happy, and you've been sad for a long time." Out of the mouths of children came the truest wisdom. Eric had been sad for a long time, sad about losing his career, losing Sarah, losing his sense of purpose. Maybe it was time to let himself be something other than sad. He called Eloise Sunday evening and accepted the position. The transition from janitor to director of flight operations was surreal. Eric got an office, a company email, a parking spot with his name on it. The engineers who'd watched him clean their workspace now sought his input on rotor designs and control systems. Eloise consulted him on aircraft acquisition and development strategy. Slowly, Eric remembered who he used to be, confident, capable, someone whose opinion mattered. But he also stayed humble. Every morning, he drove past the janitorial supply closet and remembered what it felt like to be invisible. He learned the names of the maintenance staff, treated them with respect, never forgot that circumstances could change in an instant. Eloise and Eric developed an unexpected friendship. They didn't agree on everything. She was cutthroat businesswoman, he was military-trained engineer, but they balanced each other. She pushed for aggressive growth. He insisted on safety and quality. She thought in profit margins. He thought in lives saved. Together, they made Aerosky better. 6 months into his new position, Eric was working late reviewing test data when Eloise knocked on his office door. She looked uncharacteristically uncertain. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Sure." "Do you regret the years you spent as a janitor, the time you lost?" Eric thought about it carefully. "I regret the pain that got me there. I regret losing Sarah, losing my Air Force career, the depression that made me hide. But the janitorial work itself? No. It kept me employed when I had nothing else. It gave me flexible hours to raise Ella. It taught me humility, and it led here, to this, to finding purpose again. Sometimes you have to go through the darkness to find your way back to the light." "That's very philosophical," Eloise said with a small smile. "I've had a lot of time to think about it." Eric hesitated, then asked, "What about you?" Do you regret mocking me that day in the hangar? Every time I remember it, Eloise admitted. I was arrogant and cruel. I judged you by your uniform instead of your character. That's not who I want to be. You've changed, Eric observed. The employees notice. You're less intimidating. I'm learning that fear isn't the same as respect. You taught me that. The way the engineers respond to you, they trust you because you treat them as equals, not subordinates. That's leadership I didn't know how to do. They talked for another hour about leadership and loss, about rebuilding after tragedy, about finding meaning in unexpected places. It was the first time Eloise had been truly vulnerable with anyone at the company, and the first time Eric had opened up about Sarah's death to someone other than Ella or Margaret. When Eloise finally left, Eric sat in his office and realized something had shifted. The crushing weight of grief and failure that he'd carried for years felt lighter. Not gone. It would never be completely gone, but manageable. He could breathe again. A year after the famous hangar flight, Aerosky Corporation was thriving in ways that went beyond just financials. The Valkyrie V9 had become their flagship product, with sales to hospitals, search and rescue operations, and corporate clients across 15 countries. Revenue had doubled, stock price was climbing steadily, industry publications were writing about Aerosky's resurgence under new leadership. But the real changes went deeper than numbers. Eric had expanded the flight operations department from just himself to a team of 7. 2 additional test pilots, 3 flight instructors who trained customer pilots, and 2 maintenance specialists who ensured aircraft met safety standards. He'd implemented rigorous testing protocols borrowed from his military experience, catching design flaws before they became safety issues. More importantly, Eric had created a feedback loop between pilots and engineers that hadn't existed before. Every test flight generated detailed reports that engineering used to improve designs. Pilots sat in on design reviews, offering operational perspectives that pure theory missed. The result was aircraft that weren't just technically impressive, but actually practical to fly. The company's second aircraft under Eric's influence was the MedStar H-4, a medical evacuation helicopter specifically designed around paramedic and pilot input. Eric had insisted on bringing EMTs and trauma nurses into the design process, asking what they needed in a flying ambulance. The result was revolutionary: modular medical equipment bays, stabilization systems that reduced turbulence for critical patients, lighting designed to allow medical procedures at night, even soundproofing to let paramedics communicate without shouting over rotor noise. When the MedStar H-4 launched, it immediately captured 30% of the medical helicopter market. Hospitals loved it because it was designed by people who actually understood emergency medicine. Eric's military background had taught him that the best equipment came from listening to the people who'd use it, not just engineers in labs. Ella was excelling in 4th grade and had joined the school's science club, where she proudly told everyone her dad designed helicopters and her soon-to-be stepmom ran an aviation company. She'd started drawing her own helicopter designs, wildly impractical but creative, showing them to Eric and Eloise for feedback. They took her seriously, explaining why certain ideas wouldn't work while encouraging her imagination. Eloise had transformed in ways that surprised even herself. She'd started eating lunch in the employee cafeteria instead of her corner office, learning people's names, asking about their families. She remembered birthdays, attended retirement parties, showed up when employees had personal crises. The staff who'd feared her a year ago now respected her, not because she'd gotten soft, but because she'd learned to care. She also made hard business decisions when necessary, but she did it with transparency instead of tyranny. When Aerosky had to lay off 12 workers during a contract dispute, Eloise personally met with each one, explained exactly why, helped them find new positions, and gave severance packages larger than required. It cost the company money short-term, but it built loyalty that paid dividends in morale and reputation. Profits remained strong, but Eloise also invested in things her MBA professors would have called inefficient: comprehensive training programs that took time away from production, safety improvements beyond regulatory requirements, employee benefits like extended parental leave and mental health support. She'd learned from Eric that taking care of people wasn't just morally right, it made business sense. Happy employees stayed longer, worked harder, innovated better. The culture at Aerosky shifted from fear-based productivity to genuine teamwork. Engineers collaborated instead of competed. Managers coached instead of commanded. Mistakes became learning opportunities instead of firing offenses. It was the kind of workplace Eloise wished had existed when she'd first inherited the company. Supportive instead of suffocating, challenging instead of crushing. But success brought new challenges. Competitors noticed Aerosky's resurgence and started poaching employees with higher salaries. Larger aviation corporations made acquisition offers, wanting to absorb Aerosky's technology and talent. Industry analysts questioned whether Eloise could maintain growth without selling out or expanding too fast. The biggest test came 14 months after Eric's promotion to Director of Flight Operations, when Aerosky received an offer from Titan Aerospace, a massive defense contractor worth billions. Titan wanted to buy Aerosky for $250 million, absorb their helicopter division, and leverage Eric's military connections to break into the tactical aviation market. The board pressured Eloise to accept. $250 million was generational wealth. She could sell, become wildly rich, move on to whatever she wanted. No more stress of leadership, no more proving herself, no more pressure to honor her father's legacy. But accepting meant firing half the workforce when Titan consolidated operations. It meant Eric losing operational independence, becoming a cog in a massive corporate machine instead of building something meaningful. It meant destroying the culture they'd worked so hard to create. "What do you think?" Eloise asked Eric late one night in her office, the Titan offer spread across her desk. Honest answer: "What should I do?" Eric looked at the numbers, then at Eloise. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to cash out, let someone else carry the burden, but part of me remembers why I stayed instead of taking Preston's offer, because running away doesn't solve anything. We've built something good here, something that matters beyond profit margins. Selling to Titan destroys that." "Then don't sell," Eric said simply. "It's not that simple. The board works for you, not the other way around. You're the majority shareholder. If you don't want to sell, don't sell." Eloise laughed bitterly. "Just like that? Ignore $250 million and keep grinding through the stress?" "No. Ignore $250 million and keep building something you believe in. There's a difference." Eric leaned forward. "Eloise, you've spent your whole life seeking approval. From your father, from the board, from industry analysts, from me. When does it become about what you actually want? When do you trust yourself enough to make the call and stand by it?" Eloise stared at him, then at the offer, then back at him. "You really think I should turn this down? I think you should decide what matters more, money or meaning. Both are valid choices. But you can't have both right now, so which one lets you sleep at night?" The next day, Eloise rejected Titan's offer. The board was furious. 2 directors resigned in protest. Stock price dipped 7% on the news. Industry publications questioned her business acumen. But Eloise slept better than she had in months, because the decision was hers and she believed in it. 6 months later, Aerosky secured contracts with 3 major hospital systems and a search and rescue organization in Canada worth $90 million combined. The company hired 30 new employees. Eloise promoted Dr. Chen to VP of Engineering. Eric launched a pilot training academy that became an industry model. The vindication wasn't about proving Titan wrong. It was about Eloise proving to herself that she could trust her own judgment. She'd chosen meaning over money, and it had worked. Not because it always would, but because she'd made the decision aligned with her values and followed through. One evening, Eric and Eloise were working late, reviewing proposals for a new medical helicopter design. They'd fallen into comfortable collaboration, bouncing ideas off each other, challenging assumptions, finding solutions neither would have reached alone. "Remember when you said you'd marry me if I flew the helicopter?" Eric asked suddenly, surprising himself by bringing it up. Eloise looked up from the technical drawings, eyebrow raised. "That was a joke, hyperbole, public mockery." "I know, but looking back it's kind of fitting, isn't it? You made this ridiculous proposal thinking I'd fail. I succeeded, and now we're here, business partners, friends, building something good together. What are you saying?" Eric wasn't entirely sure himself. Over the past year, working closely with Eloise, he'd seen past the CEO persona to the insecure woman underneath. Brilliant but lonely, driven but uncertain, hungry for connection she didn't know how to ask for. And he'd felt something shift in himself, a warmth toward her that went beyond professional respect. "I'm saying that sometimes the most unlikely things lead to the best outcomes. You mocking a janitor led to him getting his life back. A throwaway marriage proposal became a partnership that changed us both. Maybe we should stop fighting unexpected possibilities." Eloise set down the drawings, giving him her full attention. "Eric Edwards, are you asking me out?" "Maybe. Is Eloise Clark interested in dating a single father with a bad back and a 9-year-old daughter?" "Maybe." "Is Eric Edwards interested in dating a workaholic CEO with control issues and the social skills of a cactus?" They looked at each other across the conference table and laughed. Genuine, surprised, hopeful laughter. "We'd be terrible together," Eloise said. "Absolutely awful," Eric agreed. "Completely incompatible. Total disaster. When do you want to have dinner?" "How about Saturday? I'll have Margaret watch Ella." "Deal, but I'm paying. I can't have the director of flight operations thinking I can't afford a nice restaurant." "I was going to insist I pay. Chivalry isn't dead. We'll split it. Equals. Works for me." They didn't become a couple overnight. It was slow, careful, both of them carrying too many scars to rush into anything. Their first real date was at a small Italian restaurant in northwest Portland, the kind of place with red check tablecloths and family recipes that hadn't changed in 40 years. Eric arrived nervous, wearing the one sport coat he owned that didn't smell like aviation fuel, 15 minutes early because military training had made punctuality a reflex. Eloise showed up precisely on time, in jeans and a sweater, deliberately casual, wanting to be just Eloise instead of CEO Eloise Clark. They both laughed when they realized they'd chosen the same strategy, dressing down to feel more comfortable, more like real people instead of their roles. They talked for 3 hours over pasta and wine, discovering unexpected commonalities. Both had lost parents young, Eric's father to a car accident when he was 12, Eloise's mother to breast cancer when she was 16. Both had built their identities around work as a way to manage grief. Both felt like imposters sometimes. Eric because he'd lost his military career, Eloise because she'd inherited hers instead of earning it from scratch. "I never wanted to run Aerosky," Eloise admitted over tiramisu. "I wanted to be a designer. I studied engineering before my father convinced me business school was more practical. When he died and left me the company, everyone assumed I'd sell it. Some of the board members actually suggested it, said I wasn't qualified to lead an aviation firm. That pissed me off enough that I kept it just to prove them wrong." "How's that working out?" Eric asked. It was terrible for 2 years. I made mistakes constantly, alienated employees, nearly bankrupted us with a failed acquisition. Then this janitor showed up and flew my helicopter, and somehow that changed everything. Made me realize I'd been so busy proving I belonged that I'd forgotten to actually lead. You were more of a leader cleaning toilets than I was sitting in my corner office." Eric shook his head. "I was hiding, not leading. But thank you for seeing past that, for giving me a chance when you could have just kept me invisible." Their second date was at a children's science museum, with Ella along at Eric's insistence. "If this is going to be more than casual, she needs to be part of it from the start," he'd explained. Eloise had been terrified, but she'd agreed. Ella had tested Eloise thoroughly that afternoon, asking pointed questions about her intentions, her knowledge of helicopters, her opinion on whether Pluto should still be a planet. Eloise answered honestly, admitted when she didn't know things, and let Ella teach her about exhibits she found interesting. By the end of the day, Ella had pronounced Eloise acceptable and asked if they could come back next weekend. The relationship developed in fits and starts. Eloise had to learn to navigate dating someone with a child, understanding that plans changed when Ella got sick or had school events. Eric had to learn to let someone new into their tightly knit family unit, trusting that Eloise wouldn't hurt Ella or leave them both when things got hard. They argued about small things: Eloise's workaholic tendencies, Eric's reluctance to accept help, whose turn it was to choose restaurants, but they also found unexpected joy in building something together. Eloise taught Eric about business strategy, helped him understand the corporate side of aviation he'd never had to think about as a military pilot. Eric taught Eloise about aircraft design from an operator's perspective, explaining why certain engineering choices mattered in real-world conditions. They pushed each other to be better, called each other out on bullshit, celebrated each other's successes genuinely. 6 months into dating, they reached a crossroads. Eloise's ex-boyfriend, a venture capitalist named Preston, who she'd dated before inheriting Aerosky, came back into her life, offering her a position at his tech startup with equity and prestige. It was tempting. It was what she'd wanted before her father died. It was escape from the pressure of running an aviation company she'd never fully chosen. "I'm thinking about taking it," Eloise told Eric one evening at his house, while Ella did homework in her room. "Preston's startup is doing revolutionary work in autonomous vehicles. It's my chance to build something from scratch instead of inheriting it, to prove I can succeed on my own merit." Eric had felt his heart sink, but forced himself to respond calmly. "Is that what you want? Or is it running away from something hard?" "Maybe both," Eloise admitted. "I'm exhausted, Eric. 2 years of proving myself to boards and investors and employees who remember my father and find me lacking. The stress is crushing me. Preston's offer is a fresh start." "What about us?" Eric asked quietly. Eloise looked at him with pain in her eyes. "I don't know. I care about you and Ella so much, but I also need to figure out who I am separate from my father's legacy. Does that make sense?" "It does," Eric said, though it hurt. "But before you decide, I want you to think about something. You've spent 2 years trying to be your father, living up to his legacy. But you're not your father, Eloise. You're you. And the changes you've made at Aerosky, treating employees better, investing in safety, building partnerships instead of ruling by fear, those aren't your father's methods. Those are yours. Maybe the question isn't whether you can succeed on your own merit. Maybe it's whether you're willing to recognize that you already are." Eloise had cried then, the first time Eric had seen her truly break down. She talked about the pressure, the loneliness, the crushing fear that she'd destroy everything her father built. Eric held her and listened, and didn't try to fix it, just let her feel what she'd been suppressing for years. In the end, Eloise turned down Preston's offer, not because Eric asked her to, but because she realized running away wouldn't solve the deeper problem of believing in herself. She stayed at Aerosky, but she also made changes, brought in a COO to handle day-to-day operations, started therapy to deal with her father's death and the pressure of leadership, set better boundaries between work and personal life. The decision to introduce Eloise to Ella as more than just Daddy's friend came naturally after that. They were at the park on a Sunday afternoon, Ella on the swings, when Eloise asked Eric, "Do you think she'd be okay with me being part of your family? Really part of it?" "Let's find out," Eric had suggested. Ella, with 9-year-old perception, asked bluntly when they told her, "Are you going to be my stepmom?" Eloise had been terrified by the question, but she answered honestly, "I don't know yet, but I care about your dad a lot, and I think you're pretty great too. Would that be okay with you?" Ella considered this seriously, the way she approached all important decisions. "Can you fly helicopters?" "No, that's your dad's thing." "Can you do science experiments?" "I'm better at business stuff, numbers and planning." "That's okay. Daddy and I can teach you science, but you have to promise to be nice to him. He's been sad for a long time, and I don't want anyone making him sad again." Eloise's eyes had filled with tears at the protective fierceness in Ella's voice. This 9-year-old girl had watched her father grieve, watched him struggle, watched him slowly come back to life. Of course she was protective. Of course she had conditions. "I promise to do my best," Eloise said. "He's pretty special." "He really is," Ella agreed. Then, with characteristic practicality, "If you're going to be around a lot, you should know that we have pancakes every Saturday morning. Daddy always makes extra bacon even though I tell him it's too much, and we watch space documentaries on Sunday nights. Those are our traditions. You can join if you want, but you can't change them." "I wouldn't dream of changing them," Eloise promised. "But I do make really good chocolate chip pancakes." "Maybe I could add that to Saturday mornings?" Ella's eyes lit up. "With chocolate chips? Real ones? Not the fake stuff?" "The best Belgian chocolate, nothing less." "Okay, you can stay." Eric laughed at the casual acceptance, but he also felt something shift in his chest, the last guard he'd been holding around his heart releasing. Ella had given her approval. They could move forward as a family, imperfect and complicated, but genuine. They got married 2 years after the famous hangar flight, in a small ceremony at a garden overlooking Portland. Ella was flower girl, radiating joy in a lavender dress. Eric wore his Air Force dress uniform, the first time he'd put it on since medical retirement. Eloise wore elegant ivory, her father's watch on her wrist, the only piece of him she had left. During his vows, Eric said, "You challenged me to fly, and I found my wings again. You mocked my uniform, and I learned to see beyond appearances. You offered me a job, and I found a partner. You're difficult, demanding, and stubborn. You're also brilliant, brave, and the best thing that happened to me when I thought good things were over. I love you, Eloise Clark, and I promise to build a life with you that honors both our pasts while creating our future." Eloise's vows were simpler. "I judged you wrong. I saw a janitor when I should have seen a hero. You taught me that leadership is service, that strength includes vulnerability, that second chances matter. I love you, Eric Edwards, and I promise to deserve the trust you've placed in me as your wife and Ella's stepmother." They merged their lives slowly and carefully, Eloise selling her sterile condo and moving into Eric and Ella's modest house, insisting they keep it because it had Ella's memories and warmth her expensive place never possessed. Eloise learned to cook breakfast on Saturday mornings. Eric taught her about aircraft design from a pilot's perspective. Ella taught both of them that family was about showing up, not perfection. Aerosky Corporation flourished under their partnership. Eric's operational expertise combined with Eloise's business acumen made them formidable. They developed 3 new helicopter models, expanded into international markets, hired hundreds of employees. But they also maintained the culture they'd built together: respect for every employee regardless of position, investment in safety over shortcuts, recognition that profit shouldn't come at the cost of people. 5 years after the hangar flight, Eric stood in that same facility, now renovated and expanded, watching a new generation of engineers prepare another prototype for first flight. Ella, now 14, was interning in the design department for summer, showing promise as an engineer herself. Eloise came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "Do you ever think about that day when I made that ridiculous marriage proposal?" "Sometimes," Eric admitted. "I think about how close I came to staying invisible. If I hadn't spoken up, if you hadn't challenged me, I'd still be cleaning toilets and hiding from who I was." "I think about how close I came to never seeing you," Eloise replied. "How many other people have I walked past without really looking? How much talent and worth did I dismiss because I couldn't see beyond surface appearances? You've changed that now. The whole company's culture is different. We changed it together." Eloise watched the engineers work, then said quietly, "I really love you, you know. Not because you can fly helicopters or because you're brilliant. Because you see me, really see me, and love me anyway, despite all my flaws." Eric kissed her forehead. "I really love you too. And I'm grateful every day that you had the audacity to mock a janitor and challenge him to fly. Best worst proposal I ever accepted." Ella approached them, holding tablet with design schematics. "Dad, Eloise, can you look at this rotor configuration? I'm trying to optimize the blade pitch, but I think I'm missing something." Eric and Eloise bent over the tablet together, offering suggestions, asking questions, guiding Ella through the problem-solving process. 3 people from completely different places: a former janitor who used to command the skies, a CEO who'd learned leadership through humility, and a teenager who'd watched her broken father heal, building something together. That night, back at home, Eric found his old military ID card in his wallet. The photo still showed a younger man in uniform, confident and whole. But Eric didn't need that photo to know who he was anymore. He was a pilot, yes, an engineer, a father, a husband. But more than any of those labels, he was someone who'd learned that losing everything wasn't the end. It was just a different kind of beginning. He thought about Lieutenant Colonel Edwards, tactical flight instructor, who'd believed his life ended with a back injury and a medical discharge. If that man could see him now, married to the woman who'd mocked him, running the flight operations for a thriving aviation company, raising a brilliant daughter alongside a partner who challenged and supported him equally, would he recognize the outcome? Probably not. But that was okay. The best journeys took you places you never imagined. The best stories started with impossible challenges. And sometimes the most unlikely love grew from the most ridiculous proposals. "Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you." Eric Edwards had flown the helicopter, and Eloise Clark had kept her promise in the way that mattered. Not the literal absurdity of the hangar bet, but the deeper truth underneath. 2 people finding each other across impossible distance, building a life together from the wreckage of their separate pasts, learning that second chances were real and worth fighting for. He put the old ID card away and went to join his family for dinner, where Ella was explaining her rotor design ideas and Eloise was taking notes on her phone while simultaneously checking work emails. Imperfect, chaotic, beautiful, exactly the life Eric had stopped believing he deserved and learned to accept anyway. The janitor had found his wings, the CEO had found her heart, and together they'd found something neither could have built alone, a love story that started with mockery and ended with meaning, proving that sometimes the hardest flights lead to the best landings.